Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Okay, so it's been a few weeks since I created any Ryzen content on the channel, and I got to admit, I've been exhibiting a few withdrawal symptoms. So the time has come when I must once again make some kind of Ryzen related benchmark video. For this one, we're simply going to test the Ryzen 5 1400 head to head with the Ryzen 5 1600. Sounds pretty simple, and well it is. My day one Ryzen 5 coverage compared the 1500X and 1600X, as these were the only models I could get my hands on prior to release. Recently though, I did compare the 1500X and 1400 in their out-of-the-box form, as well as a 4GHz overclock. At the time I noted it would have been very cool to compare the 1600 and 1400 head-to-head under the same conditions, so I'm finally doing just that. Next week I do plan to add the Ryzen 7 1700 to the mix, once I get a little bit more time. Anyway, for this one we have the Ryzen 5 1400 versus 1600, quad versus hex, 8MB versus 16MB level 3 cache, $170 versus $220. Before we get to that, a quick recap of what we've learnt so far. When it comes to the cheaper quad-core Ryzen 5 processors, the 1400 and 1500X are very similar in terms of price. The 1400 is just $20 cheaper. That said though, it does have half as much level 3 cache on offer. We found this can make quite a large difference to performance, even for gaming. However, if you use a mid-range graphics card or really anything less than a GTX 1080, then the cache capacity makes little to no difference. So under realistic conditions for these sub $200 CPUs, the cache size doesn't make a big difference, at least when gaming. This then had me leaning towards the more affordable 1400. After all, when it comes to budget builds, every dollar counts. I also felt that if you are going to spend the extra $20 to get the 1500X, you might as well spend another $30 to get the 6-core 1600. It's not really a big leap. Speaking of the 1600, this is the golden chip of the entire Ryzen range in my opinion. The 1600X is essentially the same chip, but it lacks a cooler and costs 14% more. So in my opinion, AMD can keep that one. The R5 1600 though really is AMD's gift to enthusiasts, particularly so for those guys that stuck with them even through the whole bulldozer debacle. At $220 US, even a month after release, I still can't believe it costs just $220 US or $300 Australian. Anyway, at that price, it pokes fun at Intel's 6-core 6800K, pokes the 7600K in the eye, and just body slams the non-K model. For me, it strikes the perfect balance of everything right now. For gaming, 6 cores with SMT support is perfect, and it's much the same when looking at application performance as well. Quad cores are becoming a bit too lean, while octa cores are still overkill for the most part. That being said, the 1600 does cost $50 US more than the 1400, though I was shocked to also find a $50 difference down under. A straight currency conversion should see the 1600 cost around $70 more in Ausland, but that isn't the case. $50 Australian really isn't a huge amount of money for what we're talking about here. As many of you know, I have been a supporter of the Ryzen 5 1400 for the simple fact that at $170 it decimates the Intel competition, wrecking the Core i3 7350K, a dual core that comes at the same price. It also takes it to the Core i5 range, often beating the Core i5 7400 and 7500 by a handy margin. Anyway, we'll discuss the value of the R5 1400 a bit more in a moment. For now, let's jump to the benchmarks. Something interesting to note is that previously I wasn't able to run the 1400 with DDR4 3200 memory. This speed worked okay with the 1600X, but not the 1600 or 1400. I just assumed I was a bit unlucky here with these chips and they featured weaker memory controllers. Well, having recently updated my ASRock X370 Taichi to the latest BIOS revision, both the 1600 and 1400 now work perfectly with the XMP 3200 setting. The 1600 is also hitting a memory bandwidth of almost 38GB per second now. I'm yet to retest the Ryzen 7 chips, though I will do so shortly. Moving on, we have the Cinebench R15 results. Here we see with the 1400 and 1600 matched at 4GHz that the 6-core CPU is 55% faster. Not really a shocker though, as it does have 50% more cores. And that extra bit of performance likely comes from the larger L3 cache. Out of the box, the 1600 was 65% faster, thanks to a clock speed advantage. If like Tim you love Microsoft Excel, then the R5 1600 is the chip for you. Clock for clock at 4GHz, it was more than twice as fast as the 1400, 108% faster in fact. The 1400 is still respectable in this test, but if extreme workloads are your game, then the 1600 is a must. This will also be true for other applications that can utilise all 6 cores. We find a similar story when testing 7-zip. Here the 1600 was 50% faster than the 1400 when comparing the two at 4 GHz. Out of the box, the 1600 was 61% faster, so in terms of value, it's pretty amazing given it only costs 30% more. Here we have Adobe Premiere Pro CC, and the R5 1400 does rather well in this test, completing the workload in just 301 seconds once overclocked to 4 GHz. This meant the 1600 was just 36% faster, and while that is really a significant margin, it's clearly not receiving the full benefit of having the additional 2 cores in this application. Using Adobe Premiere Pro CC to measure power consumption, we see that the 1400 still consumes less than the 1600 even when overclocked. Total system consumption was increased by 19% though. That said, this was a good result for the 1400 as it provided 18% more performance in Premiere once overclocked. The gains were similar for the 1600. Here it consumes 16% more power once overclocked, which is fair given we saw a 13% increase in performance. With both the 1400 and 1600 overclocked to 4 GHz, the beefier 6-core chip pushed system consumption 21% higher. Please note for testing, I've only used the GTX 1080 Ti, but since we tested the 6 games I'm about to show you with the RX 480 in the previous Ryzen 5 video, we know what the limits of this GPU are. For example, the RX 480 maxed out at 84 FPS on average in Battlefield 1 at 1080p using the same quality settings. As a result, the 1400 and 1500X were GPU limited and produced the same performance. Therefore, if you are running a 1600 using the RX 480 or RX 580 graphics cards, the performance in this title will be identical to that of the 1400. Even the 1% and 0.1% performance will be very similar. However, if we remove the GPU bottleneck, or at least reduce its impact on the results by using the GTX 1080 Ti, the R5 1600 is able to stretch its legs a little more. Here we see the 4 GHz overclock leading to 22% better performance for the 1600 over the 1400 at the same frequency. Out of the box, the 1600 was faster by an even greater margin, providing 29% more performance thanks to a clock speed advantage. So if you have a higher end GPU or play at lower quality settings to achieve higher frame rates, then the 1600 will enable greater performance in this title. Previously, we found the RX 480 limited performance in Mafia III to 51 FPS on average, with a 0.1% time of 40 FPS. As you can see, the GTX 1080 Ti pushes well past this, but it again means even with the R5 1400, you can get the most out of a mid-range graphics card. Here we see once both CPUs are overclocked to 4 GHz, the 1600 still delivers 18% more performance, reaching an average of 90 FPS. It was also 33% faster when comparing the 0.1% performance and 26% faster for the 1% result. Ash's the Singularity Escalation loves them cores, so it's no surprise that the 1600 pulls well ahead here. Clock for clock, the 1600 was 30% faster than the 1400, and that's obviously a significant margin. Ash's the Singularity is mostly a CPU-bound game, so you will see similar gains even with a mid-range GPU. Out of the box, the 1600 averaged 99 FPS to the 1400's 81 FPS, making it 22% faster in Hitman. The margin was slightly reduced once overclocked. The 1600 is now 19% faster. It's interesting to note, even with the 4 GHz overclock on all cores, the 1400 can't beat the stock 1600, and this is something we've seen in every game tested so far. Overclocking the 1400 boosted Deus Ex Mankind Divided performance by 12%, hitting an average of 96 FPS. The same overclock only netted the 1600 a further 3% performance, and it appears as though we are reaching the limits of the 1080 Ti here. This would certainly appear to be true given the 7700K is also limited to around 110 FPS under these same conditions. Anyway, clock for clock at 4 GHz, despite the GPU bottleneck, the 1600 was still 16% faster than the 1400. Wrapping up the benchmarks, we have Total War Warhammer. Here the 1600 was 24% faster than the 1400 with both CPUs overclocked. Meanwhile, at the stock frequencies, the 1600 was 28% faster, at least when comparing the average frame rate anyway. Alright, so as usual, the results have given us a few things to discuss. Firstly, if application performance is vital, then the R5 1600 makes sense over the 1400, as we did see strong gains in the few applications tested. It's quite clear though, if the program can utilise those extra 2 cores, then the gains offered by the 1600 will be quite substantial. Premiere Pro CC, for example, showed the weakest gains of the applications tested, and yet it still offered a 36% performance bump. Given the 1600 costs just 30% more, that makes it a better value option here. For gamers though, it's a little less clear which way you should go. You can save money by getting the 1400, or you can spend a little bit more and ensure maximum performance with the 1600. Again, the 1600 chip does cost 30% more, but really, that's only a $50 difference, and that isn't a huge amount of money for what you're getting. If we look at the 1% data, which I feel is the more important metric for comparing CPU gaming performance, actually this data is virtually identical to the minimum frames per second result, just slightly lower, but whatever, let's not get into that one here. Looking at the 1% results, we found that the 1600 was faster by a 23% margin in Battlefield 1, 17% for Deus Ex, 20% for Hitman, 26% for Mafia III, 46% for Total War, and 29% faster in Ashes of the Singularity. This means, on average, the 1600 was 27% faster in the games tested. Obviously, the 1600 has a significant advantage over the 1400 in CPU-intensive games that use more than 4 cores. That said, if we were to test games such as For Honor, Far Cry Primal, or The Division, for example, then you would likely see little to no difference between the 1400 and 1600 processors, as these games are primarily GPU-bound, using realistic quality settings. There will also be minimal difference between the two when using a mid-range GPU targeting higher to ultra-quality type settings. Still, keeping all that in mind, it's clear that the Ryzen 5 1600 has more to offer gamers, and as more demanding titles become available, it will continue to outpace the 1400. In the end, when all's said and done, it really does just come down to $50, and when comparing these processors side by side, that's a 30% cost increase. However, looking at it more realistically, it's actually not nearly that much. The cheapest B350 boards, for example, start at $70 US, and when factoring that into the equation, that means the 1600 is now just 20% more expensive. Throw in 16GB of DDR4 memory, and now the 1600 costs just 15% more. You can see where this is going. In the end, once you factor in total system cost, $50 could account for just a 5% price increase. So looking at it that way, the 1600 does seem like the obvious choice. Still, there really are a heap of different ways you can look at this, and everyone's situation is a bit different. That said, if you are building a new system from the ground up, I suggest you cough up that extra cash for the 1600. Those extra 2 cores will certainly come in handy. Now I'm keen to throw the Ryzen 7 1700 into this comparison, probably next week, and see if it's worth spending the extra cash, or do you reach a point of diminishing returns with the 8-core processor? Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully this helped those of you trying to decide between the 4-core and 6-core Ryzen 5 models. I'm your host Steve. See you again soon, guys.